The morning sun cast long shadows across Dylan Langford's pristine office in downtown Manhattan. At 32, he was the epitome of success, commanding a financial empire that made headlines. His reflection in the floor-to-ceiling windows showed a man dressed in an impeccable charcoal suit, but his eyes held a coldness that even the warmest ray of sunlight couldn't penetrate. "Mr. Langford, your grandfather's lawyer is here," his assistant's voice crackled through the intercom. Dylan's jaw tightened imperceptibly. "Send him in." The lawyer, Mr. Harrison, entered with a solemn expression that immediately set Dylan on edge. "I'll be direct, Dylan," Harrison began, settling into the leather chair. "Your grandfather George's condition has worsened." Dylan's fingers drummed against his mahogany desk. "Get to the point, Harrison. There's a condition in the will that we need to discuss." The word condition made Dylan's carefully maintained composure crack slightly. "Condition," he repeated, his voice carrying an edge of disbelief. Harrison nodded, pulling out a document. "To inherit the estate, your grandfather requires you to be married." The silence that followed was deafening. "Married?" Dylan's laugh was hollow. "This has to be a joke." "It's not. George wants to see you settled before." Harrison's voice trailed off meaningfully. Dylan stood abruptly, pacing to the window. "How long?" "The doctors give him 3 months at most." Running a hand through his dark hair, Dylan calculated his options like the businessman he was. That afternoon, his Mercedes cut through Manhattan traffic as he headed to Mount Sinai Hospital. The pristine corridors felt suffocating as he made his way to the psychiatric ward. That's when he saw her. Dr. Emma Sullivan was speaking softly to a distressed patient, her presence radiating a calm that seemed to affect everyone around her. Her simple white coat and gentle demeanor were a stark contrast to the clinical environment. Dylan found himself pausing, watching as she successfully talked down the agitated patient. "Impressive work, doctor," he commented as she exited the room. Emma turned, startled by his presence. "Thank you, Mr. Langford." Dylan Langford. Recognition flickered in her eyes. "The Dylan Langford?" He nodded, studying her more carefully now. Her warm brown eyes and genuine smile were disarming, something he wasn't used to. "I couldn't help but overhear earlier. You're struggling to fund a new trauma center?" Emma's smile faltered slightly. "News travels fast. I have a proposition for you, Dr. Sullivan." She raised an eyebrow, intrigued despite herself. Over coffee in the hospital cafeteria, Dylan laid out his proposal with clinical precision. "A marriage of convenience?" Emma's voice was incredulous. 3 months, maybe 4. You get your trauma center funded. I get my inheritance." "This is insane," she whispered, but Dylan could see the wheels turning in her mind. He knew she was thinking about all the patients she could help with proper funding. "Think about it, Dr. Sullivan. How many lives could you save with a fully equipped trauma center?" Emma stared into her coffee cup, conflict evident on her face. "Why me?" she finally asked. "Because you're genuine, respected, and from what I've observed, excellent at keeping your professional composure." She looked up, meeting his gaze. "And what happens after?" "Clean divorce, no strings attached. You get the funding regardless." Emma stood suddenly, gathering her coat. "I need time to think." "You have until tomorrow," Dylan replied, sliding his business card across the table. As he watched her walk away, Dylan couldn't shake the feeling that he'd just set something in motion that was beyond his control. Later that night, alone in his penthouse, he received a text. "I'll do it. For my patients. But I have conditions of my own." Dylan smiled. Phase 1 of his plan was complete. Little did he know, this calculated move would be the beginning of his own transformation. The next morning, Dylan found Emma waiting in his office lobby, her professional demeanor masking any uncertainty. "You've made your decision then?" He gestured for her to enter his private office. The morning light caught the subtle highlights in her auburn hair as she took a seat. "I have conditions," Emma stated firmly, her clinical training evident in her composure. Dylan leaned back in his chair, an amused smile playing at his lips. "I'm listening. First, we need to make this believable. Your grandfather deserves better than an obvious charade." Something in her tone made Dylan pause. She actually cared about George's feelings. "Second, I want the trauma center funding in writing, legally binding, regardless of the outcome." "Done," Dylan responded without hesitation. "And third," Emma's voice softened slightly. I want to meet your grandfather before we proceed. This caught Dylan off guard. That wasn't part of the original plan. If I'm going to be part of this, I need to understand who I'm doing this for. Her integrity was both admirable and irritating to Dylan. Fine, he conceded. We'll visit him this afternoon. The drive to the private medical facility where George resided was silent. Emma spent the time observing Dylan's tense profile, her psychological training picking up subtle signs of stress. When they arrived, George's face lit up at seeing his grandson, then turned curious at Emma's presence. Grandpa, this is Dr. Emma Sullivan, Dylan began awkwardly. Please call me Emma. She smiled warmly, taking the elderly man's hand. What happened next surprised Dylan completely. Emma sat by George's bedside, asking him about his life, his hopes for Dylan, showing genuine interest. George responded to her warmth immediately, his eyes twinkling as he shared stories of Dylan's childhood. He was always so serious. George chuckled weakly, even as a little boy. Dylan watched from the corner, feeling strangely exposed. The business was everything to him after his parents. George's voice trailed off. Emma's eyes met Dylan's across the room, understanding dawning in their depths. After an hour, as they prepared to leave, George caught Emma's hand. You're good for him, he whispered, making her heart twist with guilt. In the car, Emma was unusually quiet. We need to discuss the timeline, Dylan began all business. Your parents, Emma interrupted softly. What happened to them? Dylan's hands tightened on the steering wheel. Car accident. I was 12. And you went to live with George? This isn't a therapy session, doctor. His tone turned cold. Emma turned to look at him directly. If we're going to do this, I need to understand you. There's nothing to understand. This is a business arrangement, nothing more. But as they pulled up to her modest apartment building, Emma had one last thing to say. You're wrong, Dylan. There's always more to understand. She left him sitting there, her words echoing in his mind. That night, Dylan drafted the contract with meticulous care. But for the first time in years, he found himself thinking about his parents. About George. About the walls he'd built so carefully around himself. And somewhere in the back of his mind, a small voice wondered if he'd just made a deal that would cost him more than he bargained for. The next morning, the papers were signed. Operation Marriage of Convenience was officially underway. But as Emma's signature dried on the document, neither of them could have predicted how their carefully laid plans would unravel, or how a contract meant to secure an inheritance would end up risking their hearts instead. The next 2 weeks passed in a whirlwind of carefully orchestrated appearances. Dylan insisted Emma move into his penthouse immediately. Appearances were everything in Manhattan's elite circles. Your wardrobe needs an upgrade, he announced one morning, eyeing her simple blazer with barely concealed disapproval. Emma crossed her arms, standing her ground. I'm a doctor, not a socialite. You're about to be Mrs. Langford. That means certain expectations. The shopping spree that followed was both exhausting and surreal. Designer boutiques welcomed them with champagne and excessive flattery, while Dylan selected outfit after outfit. I feel like a dress-up doll, Emma muttered, emerging in a stunning emerald evening gown. The words died on her lips when she saw Dylan's expression. For a moment, something flickered in his eyes. Perfect, he said quietly, then quickly resumed his businesslike demeanor. Their first public appearance was at a charity gala benefiting local hospitals. Emma felt everyone's curious gazes. Who was this unknown doctor who had captured Manhattan's most eligible bachelor? Relax, Dylan whispered, his hand warm on the small of her back. You're doing fine. But it wasn't the socialite's scrutiny that unnerved her. It was the growing comfort she felt in Dylan's presence. At home, they developed an unexpected routine. Emma would often find Dylan working late in his home office, his usual sharp edges softened by fatigue. She'd bring him coffee, just the way he liked it, black, 2 sugars. He never thanked her, but she noticed he always drank it. One evening, she heard him on the phone with George's doctors. The worry in his voice was palpable, though he tried to hide it. The treatment isn't working as well as we hoped, he said later, staring out at the city lights. Without thinking, Emma placed her hand over his. I'll review his case files tomorrow. Dylan looked at their joined hands, but didn't pull away. The next day, Emma spent hours consulting with George's medical team. She suggested alternative treatments, drawing on her psychiatric training to address the mind-body connection. When George showed slight improvement, Dylan's relief was evident. "You didn't have to do that," he said over dinner. Emma smiled softly. "That's what family does." The word family hung between them, heavy with implications. Their carefully constructed facade began to show unexpected cracks. Dylan found himself watching Emma as she worked from home, admiring her dedication to her patients. Emma caught herself anticipating his return each evening, missing his presence when he worked late. Their act was becoming dangerously convincing. One night, a thunderstorm rattled the penthouse windows. Emma found Dylan in the living room, unusually tense. "I hate storms," he admitted quietly. "The night my parents—" She sat with him until dawn, listening as he finally shared the story of that rainy night 20 years ago. It was the first time he'd told anyone the full truth. By morning, something had shifted between them. The lines between pretense and reality were beginning to blur. And in the growing light of dawn, both wondered if they were still just playing their parts, or if somewhere along the way, the act had become something real. Neither dared to ask the question out loud. But as they prepared to face another day of their carefully choreographed charade, both felt the weight of unspoken truths growing heavier. The inheritance that had seemed so important was slowly being overshadowed by something neither had anticipated. The possibility that their greatest risk wasn't losing the fortune, but losing their hearts instead. The autumn air carried a hint of change as Emma made her rounds at Mount Sinai. Her marriage to Dylan was now entering its second month, and nothing was going according to plan. Dr. Sullivan Langford, a nurse, called out, the new surname still foreign to Emma's ears. She found herself attending to a young trauma patient, barely 16, who'd attempted suicide. The girl reminded her painfully of her first patient loss, another reason she needed that trauma center. Back at the penthouse, she was surprised to find Dylan home early. "Rough day?" he asked, noticing her exhausted expression. Emma sank into the plush sofa, closing her eyes. "Lost a patient today." Dylan hesitated, then did something unexpected. He made her tea. "You never talk about what it's like," he said, handing her the steaming cup. "Dealing with death." "Like you never talk about your parents," she replied softly. The silence that followed was heavy with understanding. "I was in a board meeting today," Dylan began, loosening his tie. "All I could think about was whether you'd be home." Emma's heart skipped a beat at his admission. "This is getting complicated, isn't it?" she whispered. Before he could respond, his phone buzzed. George's doctor. His condition's deteriorating. Dylan's voice was tight. "We need to go." The drive to the hospital was tense, their earlier moment forgotten in the rush of worry. George looked frail against the white hospital sheets, but his eyes lit up seeing them together. "My favorite couple," he smiled weakly. Emma felt Dylan's hand find hers, not for show, but for support. As George drifted off to sleep, they remained in the room, their fingers intertwined. "I can't lose him too," Dylan confessed in the dimly lit room. Emma squeezed his hand. "You won't be alone if you do." Later that night, back home, something had irreversibly changed. Dylan found Emma in his home office, reviewing George's medical files. "There's a new treatment protocol," she explained without looking up. "I've been researching." He cut her off by gently closing her laptop. "Why do you care so much?" he asked, his voice raw with emotion. Emma met his gaze. "Because somehow, you started mattering to me." The admission hung between them like a fragile thread. "This isn't what we agreed to," Dylan said, but there was no conviction in his voice. "No," Emma agreed. "It's becoming something else entirely." They stood there, the New York skyline twinkling behind them, both aware they were crossing a line. "I should go to bed," Emma finally said, but didn't move. Dylan reached out, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. The gesture was tender, unplanned, and completely real. "Stay," he whispered. "Just stay here with me." And so she did, as they worked through George's medical files together. By morning, they had both realized a fundamental truth. The walls they'd built to protect themselves were crumbling, and neither of them was sure they wanted to rebuild them. George's condition had brought them together out of necessity, but something deeper was keeping them there. As the sun rose over Manhattan, casting golden light across their tired faces. They both knew their carefully constructed charade was evolving into something far more dangerous. Truth. And in the quiet morning hours, that truth felt more valuable than any inheritance. The crisp October morning brought unexpected news that would shatter their delicate balance. Dylan Langford's marriage exposed. Sources claim business deal behind romance. The headline blazed across every major business publication in New York. Emma's hands trembled as she read the article on her tablet, her morning coffee growing cold. Anonymous sources close to the Langford empire reveal shocking details about CEO's convenient marriage arrangement. The elevator doors opened, and Dylan stormed into the penthouse, his face a mask of controlled fury. "It's being handled," he announced tersely, loosening his tie with sharp movements. But Emma could see the strain beneath his composed exterior. "George," she whispered, her heart sinking. "Has he seen it?" Dylan's silence was answer enough. His nurse called. "He's refusing treatment today." The weight of those words hung heavy in the air between them. Emma moved toward him instinctively, reaching for his hand. To her surprise, he didn't pull away. "I need to tell you something," she said softly, "before everything falls apart." Dylan turned to her, his blue eyes stormy with emotion. "These past weeks, they haven't been pretend for me anymore." The confession escaped her lips before she could stop it. Dylan's breath caught, his carefully maintained facade cracking. "Emma, don't," he warned, but his voice held a note of desperation. "Why not?" "Because it wasn't part of our contract." She stepped closer, challenging him. "Tell me you don't feel it too. Tell me this is still just business." Dylan ran a hand through his hair, his internal struggle visible. "What I feel doesn't matter. The truth is out there now." "The truth?" Emma laughed softly. "The truth is that I've fallen in love with you, Dylan Langford." The words hung in the air like crystals, fragile and beautiful. "And I think," she continued, her voice barely a whisper, "you're falling for me too." Dylan turned away, staring out at the city he'd always thought he understood. "Love isn't part of my world, Emma. It never has been." "Because you never let it be," she challenged. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken emotions. Finally, Dylan spoke, his voice rough with feeling. "I need to go see George. He deserves to hear the truth from me." "Let me come with you," Emma pleaded. "No," he said firmly. "I need to do this alone." As he reached the door, he paused. "Emma." His voice was softer now. "Yes. What I feel, it scares me." The admission hung in the air as he left, leaving Emma alone with tears in her eyes. She knew that moment marked a turning point. Their carefully constructed world was crumbling. But perhaps, she thought, something more real could rise from the ashes. In her heart, she knew one truth remained. Sometimes the most precious things in life come disguised as our greatest fears. And as the sun set over Manhattan, casting long shadows across their empty penthouse, both Dylan and Emma faced the reality that some contracts were meant to be broken. Because sometimes, the heart writes its own terms and conditions, and no amount of business acumen could protect against love's hostile takeover. The hospital corridors had never felt longer as Dylan made his way to George's room. Each step echoed with the weight of truths he could no longer hide. Through the window, he could see his grandfather sitting in bed, today's newspaper clutched in his weathered hands. "So," George spoke without looking up as Dylan entered, "it was all a lie." The pain in his voice cut deeper than any business loss Dylan had ever faced. "Not everything," Dylan found himself saying, surprising even himself. George finally looked up, his eyes filled with a mixture of hurt and wisdom. "Tell me the truth, Dylan. All of it. I deserve that much." And so, for the first time in his life, Dylan Langford let his walls completely crumble. "Yes, it started as a contract," he admitted, sinking into the chair beside the bed. "But Emma, she changed everything, Grandpa. She changed me." George's expression softened slightly, encouraging Dylan to continue. "She made me remember what it was like before Mom and Dad died. Before I buried myself in spreadsheets and profit margins." His voice cracked with emotion he'd suppressed for 20 years. "I thought I was so clever, finding a way to secure the inheritance. But, Emma," A small smile touched George's lips. She made you feel again? Dylan nodded, running his hands over his face. I'm terrified, Grandpa. I don't know how to do this. George reached out, taking his grandson's hand. Love isn't something you do, Dylan. It's something you feel. But what if I mess it up? What if I lose her too? The vulnerability in his voice reminded George of the 12-year-old boy who'd lost everything. That's the risk of love, my boy. But it's also the reward. Suddenly, Dylan's phone buzzed. A message from Emma. I'm leaving for a while. I need space to think. Take care of George. His heart plummeted as he read the words. She's gone, he whispered, the reality hitting him like a physical blow. George squeezed his hand. Then what are you still doing here? Dylan looked up, confused. 20 years ago, you lost your parents without a choice. But this time, you have one. Understanding dawned in Dylan's eyes. Go, George urged. Show her what she means to you. Break free from the contracts and calculations. Dylan stood, determination replacing fear in his expression. But what about you? George smiled. I'm not going anywhere yet. Not until I see my grandson truly happy. As Dylan rushed out of the hospital, his heart racing with purpose, he finally understood what his grandfather had tried to teach him all along. That sometimes the greatest risk in life isn't taking a chance on love, but living without it entirely. And as he drove through the rain-slicked streets of Manhattan, Dylan Langford, for the first time in his adult life, wasn't thinking about business strategies or profit margins. He was thinking about the woman who had shown him that the heart's calculations were more valuable than any spreadsheet could ever be. The question was, would he be too late to prove it to her? Rain pounded against the windshield as Dylan's Mercedes cut through Manhattan's evening traffic. His mind raced faster than his car, replaying every moment with Emma, seeing them now through new eyes. The coffee she'd bring him late at night, not because she had to, but because she cared. The way she'd look at him when she thought he wasn't watching, her eyes filled with something he'd been too afraid to name. Where would she go? He muttered to himself, gripping the steering wheel tighter. Then it hit him, the trauma center, her dream that had started all of this. The construction site was dark and quiet when he arrived, but there she was. Emma stood in the unfinished building, her silhouette illuminated by the city lights filtering through bare windows. I thought I'd find you here, his voice echoed in the empty space. She turned, surprise flickering across her face. Dylan, you know, he began, stepping closer. For someone so skilled at reading others, you can be remarkably blind. Emma tensed. What do you mean? You left before I could tell you my truth. Rain dripped from his expensive suit, but for once, Dylan Langford couldn't care less about appearances. I've spent 20 years building walls, he continued, his voice raw with emotion. 20 years turning myself into someone who couldn't be hurt again. Emma remained silent, but her eyes never left his. Then you walked into my life with your warmth and your genuine care for others. He took another step closer, and suddenly, spreadsheets and profit margins weren't enough anymore. Dylan, Emma whispered, her voice trembling. No, let me finish. You want to know my truth, Emma? Here it is. His heart pounded as he closed the distance between them. I love how you bring me coffee at midnight. Not because it's your duty, but because you worry about me. I love how you fought for George's health like he was your own grandfather. I love how you see through every wall I've built and refuse to let me hide. Tears glistened in Emma's eyes as he continued. But most of all, I love that you showed me it's okay to feel again, to be vulnerable again. Are you saying? Her voice trailed off, hope warring with caution in her eyes. I'm saying I love you, Emma Sullivan. Not because of a contract, but because you made me remember what living really means. The silence that followed was broken only by the soft patter of rain against the windows. I'm terrified, he admitted with a shaky laugh. I have no spreadsheet for this, no bus. Ines strategy. Emma stepped forward, placing her hand over his heart. Sometimes the best things in life can't be calculated, she whispered. Stay with me, Dylan breathed. Not because of a contract, but because we both choose it. Instead of answering, Emma rose on her tiptoes and pressed her lips to his. In that moment, in an unfinished building that represented both their dreams, Dylan Langford finally understood what his grandfather had tried to teach him. That true wealth wasn't measured in dollars and cents, but in the courage to open your heart to love. As they held each other in the rain-swept darkness, both knew that their contract had evolved into something far more valuable. A choice to love, to trust, to build something real together. And somewhere in a hospital room across town, George Langford smiled, knowing his grandson had finally received his true inheritance. The ability to love without reservation. The morning light filtered through the windows of Mount Sinai Hospital, casting a warm glow on George's smiling face. "So," he said, eyes twinkling as he looked at Dylan and Emma, "I hear you two finally figured things out." Emma's hand was intertwined with Dylan's, no longer for show, but from genuine desire for connection. "Grandpa," Dylan began, his voice carrying a warmth that had been absent for 20 years, "I understand now what you were trying to teach me." "And what's that, my boy?" George asked, though his knowing smile suggested he already knew. "That the most valuable things in life can't be measured in dollars and cents." Emma squeezed his hand, pride shining in her eyes. "The trauma center," Dylan continued, turning to Emma, "it's not just funded anymore. I want to help you build it, make it something we create together." George watched as his grandson spoke, seeing the man he'd always hoped Dylan would become. "There's something else," Emma added, her free hand unconsciously moving to her stomach. Both men looked at her, curiosity evident in their expressions. "I found out yesterday." She paused, emotions making her voice quaver. "We're going to have a baby." The silence that followed was filled with pure joy. Dylan's face transformed with an expression of wonder that made him look years younger. "A baby," he whispered, his hand trembling as he placed it over Emma's. George's eyes filled with tears of happiness. "Life," he said softly, "has a wonderful way of giving us exactly what we need, even when we think we want something else entirely." As if to prove his point, the doctor entered with unexpected news. "Mr. Langford," she smiled, addressing George, "your latest tests show remarkable improvement." Dylan and Emma exchanged knowing looks. Their love hadn't just healed their own hearts. Later that evening, as they stood on their penthouse balcony watching the sunset, Dylan pulled Emma close, his hand resting protectively over her stomach. "You know," he mused, "Ed, I spent years thinking I had everything figured out." Emma leaned back against him, smiling. "And now? Now I know that the best things in life are the ones you can't plan for." As the city lights began to twinkle beneath them, they both knew that their story was far from over. It was in fact just beginning, a new chapter written not in the language of contracts and conditions, but in the universal dialect of love, family, and the courage to choose happiness. And somewhere in their future, a little one would join their story, carrying forward the legacy of a love that began with a contract, but bloomed into something far more precious. A testament to the power of opening one's heart to unexpected possibilities, and the beautiful chaos that comes with choosing love over logic. As New York's symphony of lights played out before them, Dylan and Emma knew they had found their true inheritance. Each other. And that was worth more than all the fortunes in the world. The end.